Good night, friend. I am so glad you are here. Tonight we are going somewhere that most people think they already know, and that is exactly the trap. Because when you hear the words Roman nobility, something very specific probably appears in your mind. Marble columns catching afternoon light, togas draped with impossible elegance, men in the Senate making speeches that still echo through history, banquets so excessive they became legend, and yes, all of that is somewhere in the picture. But it is the edges of that picture, the parts that never make it into the history books or the Hollywood films, that are the most extraordinary, the parts that belong not to the generals and the emperors but to the women and the households and the daily, ordinary, miraculous machinery of a life lived in Rome at the height of its power. So settle in, pull whatever is softest a little closer, let the room get quieter, and let me take you somewhere you have never quite been before, even if you think you have. Before we begin properly, just a small ask. If this kind of storytelling, this slow, careful walk through the past, feels like the right company for your evenings, would you take a second to subscribe and leave a like? It genuinely means the world, and it helps more people find their way here. Drop a comment too if you like. Tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight, what time it is, whether it is raining or still. I love knowing we are all out there together, each in our own corner of the dark. Now, dim the lights if you can, let the night settle around you, and let us go back. Let us go back nearly 2,000 years, to a city of 1,000,000 people, to marble and mud and olive oil and ambition, to a world that was breathtakingly sophisticated in some ways and completely alien in others, to a world where the question of who you were born to determined almost everything about how you would live, what you would eat, who would dress you, what gods you would pray to, and how long you would sleep. Let us go to Rome. It is the 1st century of the Common Era. The city is alive before you're even aware it is morning. The streets that run below the great houses on the Palatine Hill are already loud with carts, because wheeled vehicles were actually banned from central Rome during daylight hours to manage the chaos of traffic. So the merchants and the deliverymen and the tradespeople worked through the night, rumbling over the stones, shouting at mules, stacking goods outside bakeries and warehouses and the doorways of tabernae while the city slept, or tried to. The noise was constant. Roman satirists complained about it endlessly. Juvenal, writing in the late 1st century, described the sleeplessness of the city with visible irritation, observing that a man could not afford a house with wheels grinding past all night unless he was either very rich or very dead to the world. And this is where our story actually begins. Because the first thing to understand about the Roman nobility, the senatorial class, the equestrians, the old families with their ancient names and their vast country estates and their townhouses on the Palatine, is that even they could not entirely escape the city. They could buy distance and height, they could build walls thick enough to muffle some of the noise, but Rome was still Rome, and Rome was never ever quiet. Picture one of these houses, a domus, which is the word for a private home belonging to a family of means, not an insula, which was the word for the apartment buildings that stacked up 6 and 7 stories high in the poorer districts, where a fire on the ground floor could kill everyone above before they had time to reach the stairs. A domus was something different entirely. It was built around an atrium, which was an open central hall with a rectangular pool in the floor, the impluvium, designed to catch rainwater that fell through the opening in the roof above. This was not decorative, though it was certainly that. It was practical. Water was precious and collected carefully. Around the atrium would be the tablinum, a kind of formal reception room where the paterfamilias, the male head of household, conducted business and received visitors. There would be a triclinium, the dining room, which we will spend considerable time in tonight. There would be a colina, the kitchen, always positioned carefully and always somewhat suspect in the minds of Roman architects because fire was the great terror of the city. There would be a garden. In the larger and more prosperous houses, a peristyle garden surrounded by columns, with fountains and statuary and carefully tended plantings of roses and bay laurel and herbs. And there would be sleeping rooms, cubiculi, small, often surprisingly small by our expectations, because the Romans did not use the bedroom the way we do. The bedroom was not a sanctuary. It was not a room of comfort and intimacy and personal expression. It was a room for sleeping and not much more. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let us go back to the morning, because that is where the day truly reveals its character. The Roman day was divided in a way that took no account of what we would recognize as timekeeping. The 12 hours of daylight and the 12 hours of darkness shifted in length with the seasons, meaning a summer hour was considerably longer than a winter one. This sounds deeply inconvenient, and it was, unless you had grown up with no other system and simply did not know it. The first hour of the day began at sunrise. Business was conducted in the morning, social calls were made, the forum was busy, markets were open, and the most important activity of a nobleman's morning was something called the salutatio. The salutatio was a formal morning reception. It was one of the defining social rituals of Roman aristocratic life, and it was something that affected everyone, from the most powerful senator to the humblest client who came to pay his respects. Here is how it worked. A Roman nobleman of any standing was expected to hold court in the morning hours. He would be available in his atrium or tablinum to receive visitors, and those visitors would come in order of their importance. First, the friends of equal rank, the amici, men who came not to ask for anything but simply to maintain the social fabric of mutual respect and obligation. Then the clients, the clientes, men who depended on the patronage of the great man, who came to show their loyalty, to receive small gifts of food or money called the sportula, to ask for favors, for letters of recommendation, for legal assistance, for the thousand small and large things that the Roman web of patronage provided. This was not optional. Not attending your patron's salutatio was a meaningful social statement and not a friendly one. A man who stopped appearing at the morning reception was telling his patron something without words, and the message was rarely welcome. Now, here is where it gets interesting, because the saluto was almost entirely a male institution, and yet the women of the household were never absent from it either. They simply moved through it differently. The matrona, the mistress of a Roman noble household, occupied a position that was enormously more complex and powerful than the word wife tends to suggest to modern ears. A Roman matron of the senatorial class was not a decorative appendage. She was not merely a mother and hostess. She was, in many households, the actual manager of an extraordinarily complex operation. She oversaw the household slaves, of whom there might be dozens in a modest establishment and hundreds in a grand one. She managed accounts. She supervised the storage and use of provisions. She directed the preparation of food. She organized the entertainment schedule. She received her own visitors. She maintained the family's social reputation in ways that were utterly indispensable to her husband's political career. And she did all of this while navigating a legal and social system that told her, simultaneously, that she was under the authority of her husband or her father, and that she was expected to be capable, educated, and utterly competent. The Roman matron's morning began, if we are following the household of, say, a senator of moderate wealth in the time of the Emperor Augustus or Tiberius, with the arrival of her personal slaves. She would not have dressed herself. The application of clothing in a Roman noble household was an attended process, not because the garments were physically impossible to put on alone, though some of them were certainly complicated, but because having attendants was part of what it meant to be who she was. A woman who dressed herself was a woman without sufficient slaves, and a woman without sufficient slaves was a woman whose household was in trouble. The Roman woman's primary garment was the stola, a long dress worn over a tunica, which was the universal undergarment of the Roman world, essentially a simple linen tube with sleeves or without, depending on the season and preference. The stola was a marker of status and respectability. Only Roman citizen women of good standing were supposed to wear it. It fastened at the shoulders and fell to the floor, and over it a woman might drape a palla, a large rectangular length of fabric that could be arranged as a shawl, pulled up to cover the head, or wrapped in various ways depending on the occasion. The dressing process was attended by a vesterix, a slave or sometimes a freed woman, whose specific job was the management of clothing. There would also be an ornatrix, whose job was the hair and makeup, and this is where we must slow down and spend some time, because Roman beauty practices were extraordinary. Roman women of the nobility, and women who aspired to join their ranks, were operating within a beauty culture of remarkable sophistication and, in some cases, genuine danger. The basic structure of what was considered attractive in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era involved pale skin, which was associated with leisure and refinement and the indoor life that distinguished a lady from a labourer. It involved dark, thick eyebrows. It involved hair that was elaborate and structured, often built up high on the head in architectures of curls and braids that required hours of work, slave labour, heated irons, and not infrequently false hairpieces made from the hair of Germanic or Eastern captives, which sold at Roman markets in bulk. Ovid, the poet, writing in the 1st century, noted with some wry sympathy that a Roman woman's hair was done and done again so many times in a single morning that it was frankly remarkable she had any left. He was writing as a man who found the whole production slightly exhausting to observe, but he was also documenting something real. The Roman ornatrix was a skilled professional trained in curling, braiding, colouring, and arranging hair. She used heated metal rods that were not so different in principle from the curling irons of the 19th century. She used oil and wax to hold styles in place. She built extraordinary architectural arrangements on her mistress's head, arrangements that communicated social status as clearly as any piece of jewellery. And the jewellery. Let us talk about Roman jewellery for a moment, because it tells you a great deal about how wealth was displayed and what it meant. A wealthy Roman woman wore gold earrings, often quite elaborate, set with pearls or emeralds or garnets, gold bracelets, sometimes several on each arm, gold necklaces, finger rings on multiple fingers, sometimes more than one per finger, which was fashionable enough in some periods that satirists mocked women who wore rings in summer and kept them off in winter, implying they were faking the weight of what they actually owned. The pearls deserve particular attention. Roman women were obsessed with pearls in a way that contemporaries found either admirable or appalling depending on their perspective. Pliny the Elder, in his monumental work on natural history, describes pearls that were worth the equivalent of small fortunes, and describes Roman noblewomen wearing them not just as necklaces but as earrings so heavy that they swung and clinked and were specifically worn for the pleasure of that clinking sound. He describes Lollia Paulina, who was briefly married to the Emperor Caligula, appearing at an ordinary dinner party covered in emeralds and pearls from head to foot. Their combined value, Pliny records with audible outrage, equivalent to 40 million sesterces. He had seen her. He had watched her produce the receipts when people expressed disbelief. The receipts existed, the jewellery was real, but most Roman noblewomen were not Lollia Paulina. Most were simply wealthy women navigating a world that expected them to look the part without tipping over into the kind of excess that attracted censure. There was a Roman concept of the matrona's gravitas, a dignity and weight of presence that was considered appropriate to her station, and there was a significant difference between the jewellery that expressed that gravitas and the jewellery that crossed the line into ostentation. Where exactly that line was located shifted by era and by social circle, but it was always there. So our matrona has been dressed and adorned. Her hair has been arranged by her ornatrix, likely after considerable consultation about which style is most appropriate for the day's activities. Has she been given a small mirror to approve the final result? Yes, almost certainly. Polished bronze mirrors were in common use among Roman women of means, and a small hand mirror was an ordinary possession. She might have examined her reflection, approved or modified, requested a different arrangement of the palla, and then moved out of the bedroom to begin her actual day. And now the morning opens up, and it is considerably more complex and interesting than the modern imagination tends to picture. Let us think about what a Roman noblewoman actually did with her time, because this is one of the places where the received wisdom is most misleading. The common image is of a woman who was largely confined to the domestic sphere, sheltered and controlled and essentially decorative. And yes, there was a legal framework that placed women under the authority of male relatives, and yes, the public sphere of politics and military command was closed to them, but the actual texture of their daily lives was far more varied and autonomous than that framework suggests. A Roman noblewoman of the senatorial class managed a household economy that was genuinely substantial. If her husband owned multiple properties, as many senators did, she might be effectively running one or more of them in his absence. She handled correspondence. She oversaw the education of her children, which was not a matter of hiring a tutor and forgetting about it, but involved active participation and direction. She received visitors of her own, maintained her own social networks, which were an important part of the family's political and economic positioning, and she participated in religious life at a level that was sometimes professionally significant. The Vestal Virgins are the most famous example of Roman women in formal religious roles, but they were far from alone. Various priesthoods and religious associations had female participants and sometimes female leaders. Women made offerings, organized rituals, attended festivals, and were expected to maintain the religious observances of the household, which included daily attention to the lares, the household gods whose small bronze or terracotta figurines stood in a shrine called the lararium, which might be as simple as a niche in the wall of the atrium, or as elaborate as a small altar with carved decoration. The lararium was tended daily, offerings were made, small portions of food, incense, garlands of flowers, wine poured in libation. This was not perfunctory. This was understood as genuinely important, because the lares were the protective spirits of the household, and their goodwill needed to be maintained. A household where the lares were neglected was a household inviting trouble, and the practical management of this religious obligation fell largely to the mistress of the house. But let us also talk about something that tends to get overlooked in discussions of Roman women, and that is education. The education of daughters in Roman noble families was genuinely serious. Senatorial daughters were taught to read and write, to do basic arithmetic, to know Greek as well as Latin, to be familiar with literature and history, to understand music, often to play the lyre, and to be capable of the kind of educated conversation that made them useful social partners to their husbands rather than merely domestic managers. Cicero's daughter Tullia, to whom he wrote with evident tenderness and genuine intellectual respect, was educated to a standard that would have been impressive in any era. Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi brothers, was celebrated in Roman tradition not merely as a virtuous mother, but as a woman of remarkable education and eloquence, and letters attributed to her survive in ancient sources. Hortensia, the daughter of the great orator Quintus Hortensius, actually argued a case before the triumvirs in 42 BCE, and the sources describe her speech as so accomplished that the women were ultimately allowed to put their case before the courts. Roman women of the nobility read, they wrote, they corresponded extensively, they attended lectures and readings, they participated in the cultural life of a city that was, at its peak, the intellectual center of the Western world. This is not a minor footnote. This is the daily reality of the educated Roman noblewoman's existence. So our matrona's morning might well include some time with a book, not a book in our sense, a codex with pages. That form was still relatively new and not yet universal in the early imperial period. More likely a scroll, a volumen made of papyrus, carefully unrolled to the appropriate section, read and perhaps re-rolled and put away. She might dictate correspondence to a secretary, which was not unusual in a household of means. She might confer with her steward about the day's provisions. She might receive a friend for a morning conversation that was as substantive and sophisticated as anything happening in the men's salutations across the city. And then came the primary meal of the Roman day. And here we need to dispel some significant myths, because this is a place where Hollywood has served us poorly. The Roman day was organized around 3 meals. The enantaculum was the early morning meal, and it was not the lavish, reclining, multiple-course affair that the word Roman meal tends to conjure. It was simple, a piece of bread, perhaps dipped in olive oil or wine, some olives, some cheese, some dried fruit if available. This was breakfast in the most functional sense, eaten quickly and usually standing. Even in wealthy households, the entaculum was not a social occasion. The prandium was the midday meal, also relatively light, leftovers from the previous day, cold food, bread, maybe some vegetables or a small amount of meat. Again, not a formal sit-down affair, not a production. The cena was the main event. The cena was what people mean when they talk about Roman dining, and the cena did not happen at lunchtime. It happened in the late afternoon into the evening, typically beginning in the 8th or 9th hour of the day, which translates to roughly what we would call 2 or 3 in the afternoon in winter, or 3 to 5 in summer, and often extending well into the night. The cena in a Roman noble household was simultaneously a meal, a social occasion, a display of status, a political event, and a form of entertainment. Let us take it seriously because it deserves that. The triclinium, the dining room, was one of the most important rooms in a Roman house of any standing. In a truly grand house, there might be multiple dining rooms used for different seasons and different scales of entertaining. The word triclinium actually means 3 couches, referring to the 3 large dining couches that were arranged in a U shape around the central table. Diners reclined on these couches on their left sides, leaning on cushions, and ate with their right hands. This is the famous reclining position that appears in every illustration of Roman dining you have ever seen. And it was real, though it requires a moment's thought to understand the mechanics of it. You are lying on your left side, propped on your left elbow, facing the table. Your slaves bring food on dishes or individual portions. You eat with your right hand. There are no forks, at least not for most of the period we are discussing. There are spoons for liquids and soft foods. There are knives. And there are fingers, which were the primary utensils at most Roman meals regardless of wealth. Washing the hands before and during the meal was important and expected, and slaves circulated with water and cloths for this purpose. Now, who reclined at the Roman noble dinner table and where they sat was a matter of considerable social precision. The triclinium had 3 couches, each holding up to 3 people. The arrangement of couches into 3 positions, the imus lectus, medius lectus, and summus lectus, the lowest, middle, and highest couches, each had its own social ranking. The host typically reclined at a specific position. The most honored guest was placed in the most prestigious spot. To be invited to a Roman dinner party and then placed well on the couch hierarchy was to be publicly recognized. To be placed badly was to receive a message. Women of the household dined with the men in Roman households of this period. This is worth emphasizing because there is a persistent myth that Roman women ate separately or were excluded from the main dinner. This was not the Roman practice of the Republican and Imperial periods. Women dined in the triclinium with their husbands and guests. Earlier Roman tradition had apparently involved women sitting upright in chairs rather than reclining as a mark of proper modesty, but by the late Republic, and certainly by the early Empire, women of the elite were reclining just as the men were. Livy mentions the earlier custom as something that had already passed into the archaic. So our matrona is at the dinner table, reclining on a cushioned couch, and the cena is underway. The structure of the Roman noble dinner was divided into courses, though perhaps not in exactly the way we think of courses today. The gustatio came first, the appetizers designed to stimulate the appetite. These might include eggs, prepared in various ways, because eggs in Roman cooking were remarkably versatile and widely used. Salted fish, particularly garum, which was the fermented fish sauce that was absolutely everywhere in Roman cuisine, used as a condiment, as a flavoring, as an ingredient in almost everything, in the way that salt is used in modern cooking, but with far more complexity of flavor. There would be olives, prepared in various ways, salads of vegetables, sea urchins, for those who could afford them, which were considered a delicacy, oysters, another delicacy associated with wealth and sophistication, mushrooms, vegetables dressed with olive oil and vinegar and herbs. The prime mensae, the main courses, would follow, and here the wealth of the household became most visible. Pork was the most commonly eaten meat in Roman cooking, pigs being efficient to raise and enormously versatile in preparation. A Roman noble dinner might feature multiple preparations of pork, from roasted whole suckling pig for grand occasions, to prepared sausages, to more refined dishes. Poultry was popular, chicken being widely available, but also peacock, which was not merely decorative but genuinely eaten, its flesh considered flavorful if somewhat tough, its visual presentation at the table valued for the impression it made. Pheasants, thrushes, and various small birds were considered delicacies and appear frequently in Roman culinary sources. Fish was important and expensive, particularly fresh fish brought from the sea or from private fish ponds. Roman nobles with serious status sometimes maintained their own piscinae, elaborate private fish ponds stocked with prized species, and the men who maintained them were known to be absurdly attached to their fish, weeping at their deaths and treating them almost as pets. Cicero, with characteristic wit, referred to these men as piscinarii, fish pond men, with evident mockery. but the fish themselves were genuinely prized, and their presence at the table indicated genuine wealth. The kitchen, under the direction of the cook, who might be a highly skilled slave trained at considerable expense or an expensive hire, produced these dishes using a repertoire of techniques and flavors that would surprise modern cooks. Apicius, whose cookbook compiled in the late Roman period is the primary surviving source for Roman recipes, shows a cuisine of remarkable sophistication and complexity. Sauces were built from multiple components. Garum combined with wine reduced to a sweet, thick syrup called defrutum. Honey, pepper, cumin, lovage, coriander, and dozens of other herbs and spices traded along routes that stretched from the Indian subcontinent to the coasts of Britain. As a fetida, known to Romans as laser or silphium, was one of the most valued flavoring ingredients in the Roman kitchen, imported at enormous cost from North Africa and Persia. The secundae mensae were the dessert course, and Roman desserts leaned toward honey and fresh or dried fruit, pastry soaked in wine and honey, nut preparations, sweet cakes, fresh fruit in season, dates stuffed with pine nuts and honey. These were not the dramatic architectural confections of later European cuisine, but they were carefully prepared and clearly enjoyed. And through all of this, wine was flowing. Wine was central to Roman dining culture in a way that is difficult to overstate. Romans drank wine at nearly every meal, but they did not drink it as we drink it. Roman wine was mixed with water almost universally. Drinking unmixed wine, vinum mirum, was considered the behavior of barbarians or the seriously troubled. The correct ratio was a matter of taste and conversation, but something like 1 part wine to 2 or 3 parts water was common. The water might be plain or might be warmed or even might be seawater, which sounds terrible but was apparently a known practice. The wine itself was often quite different from modern wine, sweeter, sometimes resin-preserved in the case of wine stored in pitch-lined containers, sometimes quite old and considered improved by age. Specific wine-producing regions had reputations, and the labels mattered. Falernian wine from Campania was the most celebrated and most expensive. Secuban wine was another great name. Serving a famous vintage from a famous region was a statement about your hospitality and your wealth. Serving cheap wine, or worse, wine that was not what you claimed it was an insult your guests would discuss for years. The service of wine was managed by a slave called the pincerna, the cup-bearer, whose job was to keep glasses filled at the appropriate pace and to monitor the quality and mixture of what was being served. This was a specialized role in a household of any pretension, and in grander establishments, the pincerna might be quite a senior figure in the slave hierarchy. Because the slave hierarchy of a Roman noble household is something we must address directly, because it shaped every moment of every day in this world, and there is no way to understand Roman noble life without understanding the human infrastructure that made it possible. A senatorial household of modest wealth might own 50 slaves. A truly grand establishment, attached to a family with significant land holdings and multiple properties, might have hundreds. In the city house alone, a senator of real consequence might maintain 30 or 40 slaves for domestic purposes, each with a specific role and a defined position in the internal hierarchy that was as carefully structured as anything in the outside world. At the top of the household slave structure was typically the dispensator, the steward or manager, who kept accounts and oversaw the practical operation of the household. Below the dispensator were the various specialized slaves, the cook or cocus, who if skilled was extraordinarily valuable, the nomenclator, whose job was to remember names, specifically to whisper the names of approaching visitors to the master so he could greet them by name, which was an important social skill in a world where maintaining personal warmth with hundreds of clients was politically essential. The atriensis, who managed the atrium and the formal receiving of guests, the capsarius, who managed the library and the document storage, the lecticari, the litter-bearers, typically well-built slaves who carried the enclosed chair, the lectica, in which wealthy Romans moved around the city, because walking through Rome was, for a person of means, something you did if you wished to, not because you had to. The city's streets were narrow, loud, often flooded with sewage after rain, crowded with animals and people, and the constant overflow of commercial life into public space. A rich person moving through the city either rode in a litter, carried on the shoulders of 4 or 6 slaves, with curtains closed against the noise and smell, or moved in a group of attendants that created a kind of human traffic clearing system. Moving alone through the city streets was for people who had no choice. The personal attendants of the mistress of the house were generally female slaves, and they occupied positions that combined great intimacy with complete subordination. The ornatrix, who managed hair and cosmetics, worked in close physical proximity to her mistress every day. The cubicularia, who attended the bedroom, knew her mistress's most private habits and personal details. These women were not friends in any legal or social sense, though some relationships across the slave-mistress divide did develop genuine warmth and even something approaching friendship. The author Pliny the Younger writes with evident affection about some of his household slaves and freed people, but the structural power differential was absolute, and it could be exercised at any moment. Roman slavery was not a monolithic institution. It varied enormously depending on the type of work, the character of the owner, the skills of the slave, and the legal and social position within slavery itself. An educated slave who managed a library or tutored children occupied a vastly different world from a slave working in the mines or on a galley. A trusted dispensator who managed household accounts might accumulate a small savings called the peculium, might eventually be freed by a generous master, might after freedom become a client of the former master's household and continue in a recognizable relationship to it. A skilled and valued cook might be consulted respectfully about the day's menu. A valued ornatrix might be given gifts of fabric or small personal items. None of this changed the fundamental nature of the institution, but it shaped the texture of daily life in ways that were specific and human and complicated. Now let us think about money, because you cannot understand Roman noble life without understanding what things actually cost and what the scale of wealth actually looked like. The Roman monetary system used several different coins, and the sesta, or sestertius, is usually used as the base for historical calculations. A legionary soldier was paid in the 1st century roughly 900 sesterces a year, later raised to 1200. A skilled urban craftsman might earn something similar or slightly more. The minimum census for senatorial rank, the property qualification that entitled a family to the Senate, was 1 million sesterces. This was not a trivial sum, but it was also not the upper limit of senatorial wealth. Far from it. Pliny the Younger, whose letters give us extraordinarily detailed information about the life of the senatorial class in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries, was a man of moderate wealth by the standards of his class. He describes his income from his various properties as comfortable. His total estate was probably in the neighborhood of 20 million sesterces. This was reasonable for a senator. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the 1st century BCE politician and general who formed the first triumvirate with Caesar and Pompey, was probably the wealthiest private individual in Roman history. Ancient sources credit him with 200 million sesterces. This is a figure almost impossible to make meaningful, but think of it this way: it was enough to fund a Roman army for years. It was enough to feed the city of Rome for weeks. It was a concentration of wealth that no private individual in the modern world would find surprising in principle, but that was quite extraordinary in a pre-industrial economy. The senatorial nobility of Rome were by any measure among the wealthiest people who had ever lived up to that point in human history. They owned city houses in Rome. They owned suburban villas in the hills around the city, particularly in the Alban Hills and around the Bay of Naples, where the famous resort towns of Baiae and Puteoli were effectively summer suburbs of the Roman rich. They owned enormous agricultural estates in Italy and in the provinces, worked by slave labor on a scale that still impresses. They owned fish ponds and orchards and vineyards and olive groves. They owned apartment buildings in the city, the insulae whose rents provided a steady income. They owned ships, sometimes, through proxies because direct commerce was technically unseemly for senators. They owned, through freedmen and agents, commercial interests of various kinds. The daily expenditure of a Roman noble household was enormous by any ordinary standard. Feeding a household of 50 people, including slaves, cost money. Maintaining the physical structure of a city house cost money. Keeping up with the social obligations of the salutatio, the dinner parties, the gifts required by the patron-client relationship cost money. Pliny describes without apparent distress spending on behalf of poorer clients, funding their education, contributing to their daughters' dowries, supporting them through financial difficulty. This was not charity in our sense. It was the social contract of the patronage system, and it was essential to maintaining the network of relationships on which political influence depended. There were also the direct expenses of political life itself. Elections in the Roman Republic, and later the competitions for honors and appointments under the empire, involved expense. Games and gladiatorial shows could be required as part of holding certain magistracies, and the cost of putting on an acceptable show was significant. A Roman politician on the rise was often a Roman politician in debt, borrowing against future income from property or inheritance to fund a visible generosity that built a career. Cicero famously borrowed enormous sums to buy his house on the Palatine, because the location of your house mattered immensely. The Palatine Hill was the prestigious address in Rome from the late Republic onward, and the houses there became increasingly grand and increasingly expensive as the neighborhood's reputation grew. The Emperor Augustus was born there, and the imperial family built their palace complex on the hill over time. But before the palace complex absorbed the neighborhood, it was full of magnificent private houses belonging to the leading families of Rome. Livia Drusilla, who became the wife of Augustus and was arguably the most powerful woman in the Roman world during his reign, had a house on the Palatine that archaeologists have partially excavated and whose surviving painted walls are among the most beautiful things to survive from the ancient world. Her house, now known as the House of Livia, though the attribution is sometimes debated, contains paintings of extraordinary quality, garden scenes with birds and fruit trees and flowers, illusionistic architecture that appears to extend the walls of the rooms outward into imaginary space. Think about what it would have meant to live in a room like that. You stand in a medium-sized painted room, and the walls fall away into gardens you can almost walk into, birds that look as though they might fly past, columns and architectural details that create the illusion of depth and space. The craftsmanship required to create those paintings was the product of highly skilled specialists brought in to work on the walls of houses that could pay for the best. Because this is something worth dwelling on, the visual world of the Roman noble was extraordinarily beautiful. The modern image of ancient Rome, mostly derived from 19th century engravings that stripped away all color, is almost entirely wrong. Rome was not a world of white marble, it was a world of painted plaster and gilded bronze and brightly colored mosaic and vivid drapery and flowering gardens. The temples were painted in strong colors, red and blue and gold, their pediment sculptures picked out in vivid paint. The statues in public spaces and private houses were colored, their eyes inlaid with glass or stone, their lips tinted, their skin painted to represent human flesh. The frescoes on the walls of houses were not faint and faded as we see them now in museums and excavations, bleached by 2,000 years of burial and exposure. They were vibrant and alive, painted in pigments that cost serious money, some of them imported from far distances, some of them made from substances that we now know were dangerous, lead-based whites, mercury-based reds, arsenic-based yellows, applied by artists who worked with these materials daily without any understanding of the harm they were doing themselves. The floors of a noble Roman house were often mosaic, geometric patterns in black and white in the earlier periods, then increasingly elaborate scenes in polychrome stone and glass tesserae, sometimes of astonishing complexity. The famous Alexander mosaic from Pompeii, now in the museum in Naples, which shows Alexander the Great in battle with Darius of Persia, is approximately 5 meters by 2.5 meters in size and contains an estimated 1.5 million individual pieces of colored stone. It was made as a floor. People walked over it, or walked around it, or stood on the edge of the room and admired it, depending on how seriously the household took its care, and this was Pompeii, a prosperous but ultimately provincial town. Rome itself, at its peak, contained works of art that beggared description, bronze sculptures of Praxiteles, panel paintings that travelled from Greece to fill the homes of Roman collectors who had spent fortunes acquiring them, textiles from the eastern Mediterranean, furniture inlaid with tortoiseshell and ivory, silver plate so heavily accumulated in some households that it was mentioned in sources as essentially a separate category of family property. The Roman noble's silver was not merely table silver, it was an investment, a display, and a portable form of wealth that could be melted down in genuine emergency. Sets of silver plates and cups and serving vessels were passed through families, accumulated over generations, occasionally lost to debt or confiscation, but generally treated as patrimony of a particular weight. Pliny the Elder, cataloguing the wonders of the natural world with characteristic comprehensiveness, describes silver vessels of every kind used by the wealthy of his day, and does so with a mixture of admiration and disapproval that was characteristically Roman. Roman moralists had a persistent tendency to lament luxury while obviously being fascinated by it. The invective against excessive spending, excessive table decoration, excessive jewelry, excessive construction of great houses, this invective runs through Roman literature as a constant theme, and it tells you as much about the anxiety of the wealthy class about its own behavior as it does about actual excess. Sumptuary laws, laws designed to limit excessive spending on luxury goods, were periodically passed in Rome from the Republican period onward. They targeted dinner parties specifically, setting limits on what could be spent per head on a meal. They targeted clothing and jewelry. They targeted the number of silver vessels that could be displayed. They were, with rare exceptions, largely ignored or evaded, because the point of being wealthy in Rome was, in significant part, to be visibly wealthy, and restricting visibility struck at the heart of what the whole enterprise was for. Let us come back to the dinner party, because we left it mid-scena, and there is more to discuss about what happened there beyond the food. A Roman dinner party at a senator's house was not simply a meal. It was an evening of entertainment that might last 4 or 5 hours, and the entertainment was as carefully arranged as the menu. After the main courses were finished, the tables might be cleared and replaced with the dessert service, and this transition sometimes marked the beginning of the commissatio, a drinking session that had a more playful or Bacchic character than the formal dinner preceding it. Entertainment at a Roman cena might include poetry readings. A host might ask a guest who was known to write verse to recite something, and Pliny the Younger describes in several letters both his pleasure and his mild irritation at the length of some readings he attended. Music was common. Slave musicians played the tibia, a double reed instrument, or the cithara, a large lyre, during or between courses. This was ambient music in something like our modern sense, designed to fill the space and set a tone rather than to command attention. More elaborate entertainment might include dancers and acrobats. Performances by pantomime artists, who performed narrative scenes in mime with musical accompaniment, were fashionable in the early imperial period. More controversially, some hosts brought in performers of types that the moralists found deeply objectionable, and it is worth noting that Roman moralists found a great many things objectionable, and that their objections were partly genuine and partly performative in a long tradition of Roman virtue signaling. Intellectual conversation was also an entertainment in its own right. A well-run Roman dinner party was supposed to provide good conversation as well as good food, and a host who could assemble guests of sufficiently varied and stimulating minds was performing a genuine social service. Philosophical discussion, literary debate, questions of natural history, historical anecdotes, all of these were legitimate topics at a Roman dinner table. Pliny the Younger describes evenings where readings and discussion were the primary entertainment, and clearly found them more satisfying than mere gorging. The women at the table participated in these conversations. This is worth emphasizing again, because it is easy to assume otherwise. Roman noblewomen were educated participants in the intellectual life of their social circle, not silent decorative presences. The satirists sometimes complained about women who talked too much, or who had opinions about things they should not, and this complaint is itself evidence that the talking and the opinionating were happening. Now, let us step outside the dinner party for a moment and talk about the city itself, because Rome in its prime was a place that the Roman nobility could not avoid, even if they sometimes wished to, and engaging with it was part of their daily life in ways that shaped everything. The city had approximately 1 million inhabitants at its peak in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. 1 million people in a pre-industrial city is difficult to fully imagine. Think of the density, the noise, the smell, the constant pressure of human proximity. The Roman building code, such as it was, generally set height limits on insulae at somewhere between 60 and 70 feet, around 5 or 6 stories, but these limits were imperfectly enforced, and buildings occasionally exceeded them and occasionally collapsed, taking their occupants with them. Fire was endemic. Nero's Great Fire of 64 CE destroyed enormous swaths of the city, and fires of lesser scale were constant. The water supply was genuinely extraordinary. The Roman aqueduct system delivered fresh water to the city from sources miles away in the hills, and by the early imperial period Rome had 11 major aqueducts delivering something on the order of 1 million cubic meters of water per day. This was enough for substantial per capita availability, but it was not equally distributed. The grand houses on the hills received water from the city system through lead pipes. The public fountains, the lacus, were located throughout the city at intervals, and poorer residents fetched their water from these. The great public bath complexes, the thermae, were supplied directly from the aqueducts and open to all citizens for a very small fee, or sometimes free. The baths. We must talk about the baths, because they are one of the most remarkable social institutions of the Roman world and one of the most frequently misunderstood. Roman bathing was not primarily about personal hygiene in the way that modern showering is. It was a social activity. The public baths were social centers where Romans of all classes might mingle, though in practice class distinctions were maintained in various ways. The great imperial thermae, the baths of Caracalla, or the baths of Diocletian, whose massive ruins still stand in Rome, were essentially leisure complexes. They contained not only the bathing rooms themselves, which ranged from the frigidarium, the cold room, through the tepidarium, the warm room, to the caldarium, the hot room, and sometimes a laconicum or dry steam room similar to a sauna. They also contained libraries, exercise areas, gardens, shops, and spaces for conversation and simple socializing. The progression through the bathing suite was a ritual in itself. You began with exercise if you wished, in the outdoor palestra, running, wrestling, ball games of various kinds. You then moved into the hot rooms to sweat, and a slave, if you had one, would scrape your skin with a curved metal tool called a strigil, removing the combination of oil, sweat, and dirt that had accumulated. You might apply olive oil first, as a moisturizer and cleaning agent, since soap in the Roman world was known but not universally used for personal bathing. Then the strigil, then a rinse in progressively cooler water, finishing in the cold plunge of the frigidarium, which was bracing and considered healthy. This might happen daily or several times a week. For the wealthiest Romans, there were private bathing suites within their houses or villas, eliminating the need for public facilities altogether. But the public baths were so much more than bathing places that many nobles went even when they had private facilities at home, simply for the social interaction. A Roman noblewoman's access to public baths was more complicated than a man's. There is ongoing scholarly debate about the extent to which men and women bathed together in the public facilities. The evidence suggests that some establishments had mixed bathing, which was occasionally condemned by emperors and by moralists, while others had separate hours for men and women. A noblewoman who used public baths would typically go during the hours designated for women, likely the morning hours, while men came in the afternoon, or she might bathe in her own home. A well-appointed domus of the senatorial class would have its own bathing facility, probably including at minimum a heated room and a small cold pool. The mistress of the household might be attended by her slaves, oiled and scraped and rinsed, in something that resembled the experience of the public baths without the social component. Let us think about health and medicine for a moment, because the health of the Roman nobility was shaped by conditions and beliefs that were completely different from our own, and understanding their relationship with illness and the body illuminates the daily choices they made. Roman medicine was in a state of genuine sophistication by some measures, particularly the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, when figures like Galen of Pergamon were practicing and writing. Galen's output was enormous, his influence on medical thought lasting more than 1,000 years into the medieval period. He was physician to the emperors Marcus Aurelius and Commodus, among others, and his work on anatomy, pharmacology, and the theory of the humours was taken as authoritative through the Renaissance. The theory of the humours, which Galen refined from earlier Greek sources, held that health was a matter of balance between 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was understood as an imbalance, and treatment was aimed at restoring balance through diet, herbs, purging, bloodletting, and various other interventions. This framework was entirely wrong from a modern medical standpoint, and yet within it a genuine tradition of careful observation had produced real and useful insights about nutrition, exercise, the relationship between lifestyle and health, and the properties of various plant-based medications. Roman nobles were intensely preoccupied with their health. The letters of Pliny the Younger and Cicero are full of references to illness, both their own and that of people they cared about, and the anxiety in these letters is entirely recognizable. Pliny writes about headaches that kept him from writing. He writes about the illness of his slaves with genuine concern, both for the slaves themselves and for the disruption to the household. He writes about his wife Calpurnia's miscarriage with great distress. He writes about a friend dying and the grief of it. The Romans used a great many plant-based remedies, many of which we now know to have genuine pharmacological activity. Willow bark, which contains a precursor to aspirin, was used for pain and fever. Poppy preparations, containing opium alkaloids, were used for pain management and sleep. Garlic, which does have antimicrobial properties, was used extensively. Honey, which is genuinely antibacterial, was used in wound care. Vinegar was used as a disinfectant. Fenugreek, fennel, coriander, cumin, all of these herbs that appear constantly in Roman cooking also appear in Roman medical texts as remedies for various conditions. The wealthy had access to private physicians. A Roman senator might have a household doctor, often a Greek freedman with training in the Hippocratic tradition, who attended the family's health needs. This was considered a mark of civilized life. Going to a general practitioner in the modern sense did not exist as a social expectation, but having access to skilled medical advice was something the wealthy arranged for themselves as a matter of course. The treatments available were genuinely mixed in their effectiveness. Skilled physicians could set broken bones, perform some surgical procedures, manage wound care with some effectiveness. They could recognize patterns in disease, though their explanations for those patterns were entirely wrong by modern standards. What they could not do, having no understanding of germ theory, was prevent or effectively treat most infectious diseases, which remained the primary cause of death in the Roman world as everywhere in the pre-industrial era. Life expectancy at birth in Rome was probably somewhere in the mid-20s, which in Thigpanu and Theanu will understand that this figure is dramatically pulled down by catastrophic infant and child mortality. If you survived to the age of 5, you had a reasonable chance of living to 40 or 50. If you survived to 40, you might well live to 60 or 70 or beyond. Roman texts are full of people who lived into their 80s and 90s, and their longevity was noted and admired precisely because it was unusual enough to be remarkable. For women, childbirth was the greatest specific danger. Obstetric mortality was real and significant, and the risk accumulated with each pregnancy. A woman who survived multiple childbirths was fortunate by any measure. Roman noble families typically had fewer children than the broader population, both because they had better access to wet nurses and other forms of infant care, and possibly because they had access to contraceptive knowledge, the efficacy of which was limited but not zero. The Roman approach to pregnancy and childbirth was attended by a combination of medical knowledge and ritual practice. A midwife or obstetrix was the primary attendant at birth, not a physician, and the skills of the obstetrix varied enormously. Soranus of Ephesus, writing in the 2nd century, provides an extraordinarily detailed account of midwifery practice, and some of his advice is genuinely sound. He recommends keeping the birthing room warm, positioning the woman carefully, managing delivery in ways that minimize tearing. He also recommends a range of remedies that would be less effective, but his text is evidence of a sophisticated professional tradition in midwifery. A Roman noblewoman who was pregnant would be surrounded by attention, both practical and ritual. Offerings would be made to Juno Lucina, the goddess who governed childbirth. Amulets might be worn. Special prayers would be offered. The midwife would be engaged, possibly in advance, and would be present throughout the labor. The husband, interestingly, was typically not present, waiting elsewhere in the house while the women managed the birth. This was considered appropriate. Childbirth was women's territory in a way that few other parts of life were. Children who survived were, at least among the elite, genuinely valued and invested in. The common image of Roman infant exposure, in which unwanted children were left on hillsides or at rubbish heaps, was a real practice, but it was more associated with poverty and with the specific circumstances of illegitimacy or deformity than with the normal behavior of noble families. Roman law and Roman literature both express strong expectations of parental investment in children, and the legal system of guardianship for orphan children was designed to protect their inherited wealth for their eventual use. The education of children in a noble household began early. The pedagogue, typically a Greek slave or freedman, was responsible for accompanying children to school and supervising their general behavior and formation. The literator taught basic reading and writing. The grammaticus taught literature and the interpretation of texts, primarily the Latin poets and then Greek authors. The rhetor trained older students in the art of public speaking, which was considered the essential practical skill for a man entering public life. Girls received versions of the same education up to a point. The specific curriculum of advanced rhetoric was more oriented toward male political life, but reading, writing, literature, philosophy, music, and basic mathematical knowledge were all considered appropriate for daughters of the noble class. The evidence from letter collections and surviving references suggests that educated Roman women were capable writers and conversationalists whose intellectual abilities were taken seriously, at least in private. One woman who stands as a particularly clear example is Sulpicia, a poet who wrote in the late 1st century BCE and whose verses survive, making her the only female Latin poet whose work is securely identified. Her poems, which are love elegies addressed to a man she calls Cerinthus, are strikingly direct and unself-conscious in their expression of desire and emotion. They are not performatively modest or apologetic. They are the poems of someone who assumed she had the right to write them, and that assumption tells you something about the environment in which she lived. Now let us think about religion and ritual, because in the Roman world, religious practice was woven through every aspect of daily life in a way that is difficult to convey to a modern secular sensibility. Roman religion was not a creed. It was not a set of beliefs requiring inner conviction. It was a practice, a series of performances and observances whose proper conduct was understood to maintain the goodwill of the gods and therefore the continued well-being of the household, the city, and the empire. The word for this relationship between humans and gods was pax deorum, the peace of the gods, and maintaining it was a civic as much as a personal obligation. The domestic religion of the household was centered on several divine figures and the rituals associated with them. The Lares, the protective spirits of the household, have already been mentioned. They were closely related to the daimons, the ancestral spirits of the dead, who were also venerated and needed to be properly propitiated. The Penates were the gods of the household storeroom, associated with food supply and domestic prosperity. Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, was honored in every household through attention to the domestic fire. The Lararium was the focal point of this domestic religion. In houses at Pompeii, which give us our best surviving evidence for the domestic arrangements of the Roman world, because they were preserved by Vesuvius in 79 CE. Lararia are found throughout the houses, from simple niches painted with images of the Lara Zangenius to elaborate miniature temple structures with marble or terracotta details. Offerings were made at the Lararium regularly, particularly on the calends, nuns, and ides, the significant days of the Roman calendar, and at important life events. The genius of the paterfamilias was particularly important. This was understood as the animating spirit of the male head of household, the force that made him what he was, and it received honor from the household on his birthday and at other special occasions. The Juno of the materfamilias received similar honor. These were not exactly personal deities in the way we might imagine a patron saint, but they were the divine aspect of a specific person's essential self. Public religion required participation in festivals and sacrifices that were part of the civic calendar. Rome had an extraordinary number of religious festivals, something on the order of 40 officially recognized ones spread through the year, and various other observances associated with specific temples, gods, and occasions. Some of these were primarily observed by priests and magistrates. Others involved the participation of the general population in processions, games, feasting, and communal celebration. Women played specific roles in some of the most important of these public religious events. The Vestal Virgins, 6 women chosen in childhood and committed to 30 years of service to Vesta, occupied the most prestigious female religious role in Roman public life, and their influence extended well beyond the purely ritual. They had the power to grant pardons. Their presence at public events conferred sanctity. They lived in a special house in the Forum, the most politically charged space in Rome, and their legal status was unique, combining enormous privileges with the famous requirement of chastity, whose violation was punishable by live burial. Other religious associations had female members, and sometimes female leadership. The cult of Bonadea, the good goddess, was a specifically female cult whose rites were performed in the house of a senior magistrate each December and attended only by women of respectability, a fact that became notorious when Publius Clodius Pulcher disguised himself as a woman and infiltrated the rites held at Julius Caesar's house in 62 BCE, causing an enormous scandal that touched on political issues far beyond the religious violation itself. The mystery religions, which spread through Rome particularly in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, offered different forms of religious experience. The cults of Isis, of Cybele, of Mithras, of Bacchus provided initiatory experiences, a sense of personal transformation and direct divine contact that the civic religion did not offer. Women participated fully in several of these cults. The cult of Isis in particular was enormously popular among Roman women, who found in the goddess a divine figure with whom they could identify in her roles as wife, mother, and mourner, and who offered real religious experience rather than mere civic ritual. And Christianity was beginning its spread through this same world. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, the small communities of Christians in Rome were mostly among the poorer and more marginalized populations, but they included some women of rank. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the evidence of Christian texts and archaeological finds suggests increasing numbers of the nobility among the converts, and women were particularly active participants in the early church communities. The reasons are complex and much discussed, but they include the early church's relatively egalitarian theology, which granted women spiritual dignity, and the social networks through which Christianity spread, which ran through households and domestic connections where women had significant influence. But let us step back from religion and return to the daily texture of life, because we have not yet talked about travel and the country estates, which were genuinely important parts of the noble life cycle. Roman nobles did not spend the entire year in the city. The Italian summer was brutal in Rome, hot and humid and associated in the medical thought of the time, not entirely wrongly, with disease. The summer months brought what the Romans called the fever season, and the wealthier classes fled the city with something approaching panic. Seneca describes the September crowds heading for the coast with vivid exasperation. Horace writes longingly of his Sabine farm in the hills. Pliny the Younger describes his Laurentine villa on the coast and his Tuscan villa in the hills with loving precision, detailing the gardens, the views, the bathing suites, the reading rooms. These country villas were not merely retreats, they were fully functioning agricultural estates, producing wine, olive oil, grain, timber, wool, and a range of products that were either consumed by the household or sold for income. Managing a productive estate was a serious business, and a Roman senator of the 2nd century who owned several properties in different parts of Italy was essentially the head of a small agricultural corporation. The younger Pliny's letters about his villas are extraordinary documents of what it actually felt like to be a wealthy Roman in the countryside. He describes waking early and lying in the dark thinking, then calling for his secretary so he could dictate correspondence from bed. He describes long morning walks in his gardens, the views from the terrace, the pleasure of a small private dining room that caught the winter sun. He describes reading and writing in the afternoon. He describes being genuinely happy in a way that urban Rome never quite produced for him. The physical layouts of surviving Roman villas, particularly those preserved at Pompeii and in the Vesuvian region, and the grand villas that archaeologists have excavated in various parts of Italy, suggest environments of extraordinary beauty. Gardens laid out with geometric precision, their paths lined with clipped box hedges, their central spaces occupied by fountains and statuary, their pergolas draped with vines, long porticoed walks, the zixis that could be used for exercise in bad weather, heated dining rooms, libraries, private bath suites, fish ponds and ornamental pools. views over the sea or the hills, specifically chosen when siting the buildings so that the landscape itself was part of the composition. The women of the household were not passive passengers in these retreats to the country. Managing a country estate had its own complex of responsibilities, and in the absence of the husband in town or on official business, the matron's authority over the practical functioning of the property was real and extensive. Roman women on country estates supervised agricultural work, managed relations with tenants and farm workers, oversaw the household production of goods like cloth, maintained correspondence with the wider family network, and continued to receive visitors from the local area and from the neighboring properties of other senatorial families. Weaving and spinning had deep symbolic significance in Roman culture as virtues of the matrona. The phrase woolworking, lanificium, appears in Roman epitaphs for women as a term of highest praise, placing the woman in a tradition going back to Lucretia, the paragon of Roman womanhood, who was found by her husband spinning with her maids while other men's wives were discovered at dinners and pleasure. This was virtue as industry, virtue as domestic productivity. In practice, a Roman noblewoman of real wealth was not sitting at the loom herself in the 1st century CE. That was the work of her slave women, but she supervised it. The household weaving rooms produced fabric for the family's use, and overseeing the quality of this production, the management of the wool and linen supply, the training of the spinning and weaving women was a genuine managerial responsibility. When Roman writers praised a woman's commitment to wool work, they were sometimes praising actual domestic industry and sometimes invoking a traditional virtue that served more as a rhetorical gesture toward feminine propriety than as a literal description of how the woman spent her afternoons. The complexity of what Roman noble women actually did versus what Roman tradition said they should do is one of the most interesting tensions in Roman social history, and it runs through everything we have been exploring. The legal and theoretical framework placed women under male authority and defined their primary sphere as domestic. The actual practice of Roman noble life required women to be managers, correspondents, social operators, religious participants, and in some cases political actors of considerable sophistication. Think about Livia. We have already mentioned her in connection with her house on the Palatine, but her actual historical significance goes so much further. Livia Drusilla was born in 59 BCE and died in 29 CE, living through the entire transformation of Rome from republic to empire. She was married first to Tiberius Claudius Nero, by whom she had 2 sons, including the future emperor Tiberius. She divorced him to marry Octavian, the future Augustus, while pregnant with her 2nd son, an act that tells you something about the pragmatic brutality of aristocratic Roman marriage politics. With Augustus she had no children, which became a significant problem for the succession, but her position as his wife gave her access and influence that accumulated over a long reign. She interceded for individuals in trouble with the emperor. She managed her own substantial property interests. She conducted foreign policy in some degree through the reception of embassies and the management of relationships with client kings and queens. After Augustus's death, she was posthumously adopted into the Julian family, becoming a Julia, and she was deified after her death by her grandson, the Emperor Claudius. Ancient sources disagree violently about Livia's character, which is itself instructive. Tacitus, who disliked her, describes her as a domineering mother who manipulated both her husband and her son in pursuit of power. He suggests darkly that she may have been responsible for the deaths of various Julio-Claudian relatives who stood between Tiberius and the succession, a charge that is unverifiable and probably exaggerated. The Emperor Augustus himself, by contrast, seems to have genuinely valued her counsel, and the few surviving fragments of his correspondence show him consulting her on matters that went well beyond the domestic. She is perhaps the clearest example of how Roman noble women could exercise real power within a system theoretically designed to exclude them from it, but she was not uniquely exceptional in this regard. She was exceptional in degree, but the pattern of the educated, connected, resourceful Roman noblewoman operating effectively within and around the constraints of her legal and social position is a recurring one throughout Roman history. Consider Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, whom we have already mentioned. She was the daughter of Scipio Africanus, the general who defeated Hannibal, and she was educated and accomplished in ways that made her a celebrated figure even in her own lifetime. After the death of her husband Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, she refused a marriage proposal from Ptolemy VIII of Egypt and remained a widow, dedicated to the education of her children, of whom she bore 12, though most died young. Her surviving sons, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, were among the most significant political figures of the late 2nd century BCE, and the role she played in their formation was explicitly acknowledged in ancient sources as foundational. A famous letter purportedly from Cornelia to her son Gaius, urging him toward caution and restraint in his political ambitions, survived in antiquity and was quoted in later sources, though its authenticity has been debated. Whether authentic or not, the letter's existence and its preservation tells you that Cornelia's intellectual and moral authority were understood to be real. And then there is Agrippina the Elder, whose story is one of the most dramatic in the entire Julio-Claudian period. The granddaughter of Augustus, the wife of the beloved General Germanicus, she traveled with her husband on campaign along the Rhine frontier, and when Germanicus died in 19 CE, under circumstances that strongly suggested poisoning, she brought his ashes back to Rome in her hands. The popular response to her arrival was extraordinary, crowds lining the road, weeping, the whole city apparently moved by the spectacle of a Roman matron performing this last duty for her husband with such dignity. Agrippina had 6 surviving children and was a public figure of real consequence, and this made her dangerous to the Emperor Tiberius, who eventually had her arrested, exiled to the island of Pandateria, and left to die there, possibly of starvation in 33 CE. She was not a passive victim of politics. She actively cultivated her public reputation, maintained political relationships, and pushed against the constraints of her position in ways that Tiberius clearly found threatening. She paid for it with her life. Her daughter, Agrippina the Younger, is an even more extreme case of Roman female political agency. She manipulated the succession in ways that placed her own son Nero on the throne of the Roman Empire. She was appointed priestess of the deified Claudius. She appeared on Roman coins alongside her son, an honor almost without precedent for a living woman. She conducted foreign policy. She received embassies. She sat behind a curtain and listened to Senate proceedings. She was, by any measure, exercising imperial power in a form that the theoretical framework of Roman society said was impossible for a woman. Nero eventually had her murdered in 59 CE in a plot that required multiple attempts and whose grotesque details Tacitus records with evident relish. Her response to the final assassin, according to Tacitus, was to offer her womb to be struck, since it had borne such a son. Whether she actually said this or whether Tacitus invented it as a rhetorical flourish, the image captures something about how Roman tradition thought about women of power, extraordinary, dangerous, ultimately destroyed by the very men they had made. These are the most dramatic examples. But the ordinary lives of ordinary noble women, the senators' wives and daughters and mothers who did not make it into the political histories because they were not plotting successions or traveling on military campaigns, these were also lives of genuine substance, managing a household of 50 people with dozens of specialized roles, raising children in an intensely competitive social environment, maintaining the social networks on which the family's prosperity depended, participating in the religious life of the community, being an educated and cultured member of a society that valued intellectual achievement. These were not trivial activities. They were the texture of a life that was genuinely rich in content and responsibility. Now let us think about the end of the day, because Roman noble life did not simply continue indefinitely without structure. The day had a rhythm, and that rhythm moved toward the dinner, and then, eventually, toward rest. We have already spent considerable time with the Cena. Let us assume our dinner party is drawing to a close, sometime in the evening, after several hours of eating and drinking and conversation and entertainment. The guests are departing. The slaves are clearing the remains of the meal, carrying out the elaborate silver service to be washed and stored, removing the cushions from the couches, extinguishing most of the lamps. Oil lamps were the primary source of artificial light in a Roman house. They were small ceramic or bronze vessels containing olive oil, with a wick protruding from a spout. They gave off a warm, flickering light that was far dimmer than any modern equivalent, and using enough of them to illuminate a large room for a dinner party required both a supply of good oil and the labor of keeping the lamps trimmed, refilled, and lit. In a wealthy household, this was managed automatically by the appropriate slaves, but it represented a real ongoing cost. Candles existed in Rome, made from tallow or beeswax, but they were less common in the 1st and 2nd centuries than lamps. Wealthier households might use beeswax candles for specific purposes. The smell of burning tallow was not considered refined. As the evening wound down and the lamps were reduced to the minimum needed for moving safely through the house, the Roman noble household was entering its nighttime mode. The slaves who had been on duty through the evening were replaced by those assigned to night duty. The door slaves, the osterius and janitor, remained at the entrance. The bedroom attendants were on call. The guard function of the household was maintained. Romans slept at varying times depending on their social obligations. A man who had been entertaining, or who had been a guest at someone else's dinner, might come home quite late. The streets of Rome at night were not universally safe, though the wealthy travelled in groups with torch-bearers, and the Roman night watch, the vigiles, provided some security. The streets were dark, lit only by the lamps in windows and the occasional torch at a doorway, and they were still full of the carts and delivery vehicles that could operate only after dark. The bedroom of a Roman noble was, as we noted earlier, small by modern expectations. The cubiculum was primarily a sleeping room, not a living space. There was a bed, the lectus cubicularis, which was a frame of wood or metal supporting a mattress stuffed with wool or hay or, in the finest households, down feathers. There were cushions. There might be a small table. The rooms were kept dark by day curtains, and at night the lamp would be reduced to its minimum. The sleeping arrangements of married couples in Rome are not entirely clear from the surviving evidence. The Roman bed, the lectus, was generally narrower than a modern double bed, suggesting that shared sleeping might have been more common for couples than the separate bedroom arrangements of, say, Victorian Britain. But we also have evidence that separate sleeping rooms were used by some couples, particularly if one of them was ill or restless. Pliny the Younger mentions, with an almost comically tender domesticity, that his wife Calpurnia keeps a small lamp burning near his bedroom when he is working late, so he knows she is thinking of him. Romans did not necessarily sleep in a single unbroken block. The phenomenon of segmented sleep that we discussed in relation to Victorian Britain appears in ancient sources as well. Waking in the middle of the night was not considered aberrant. People might think, pray, have a conversation with a slave, or simply lie in the dark and reflect. The nighttime household was quieter than the day, but not entirely still. The night slaves were on duty. The animals that wealthy households kept, dogs most commonly, might make noise. The city outside, even with the daytime prohibition on wheeled vehicles lifted, was never entirely silent. And the Roman noble in his or her bed, if we follow the conventional picture, would be lying under warm woolen blankets in winter, cooler linen in summer, in a room that was lit, if at all, only by the smallest possible flame, in a city that hummed and clattered outside the walls of the house, thinking about tomorrow's salutatio, or the letter that needed to be dictated, or the dinner planned for next week, or the health of a child, or the news from the provinces, or the price of oil on the market, or any of the 1,000 things that occupy a mind that is responsible for an enormous amount and knows it. This is life in Rome, not the marble parade of emperors and battles. The daily, human, fascinating, exhausting reality of managing a complex life in a complex city at the center of the most powerful empire the Western world had yet produced. Let us turn now to the economics of this life in more detail, because money is not a superficial topic. It is the material foundation of everything we have been discussing, and the specific numbers, when they survive, are genuinely illuminating. Pliny the Younger is our most detailed source for the everyday finances of the senatorial class, and his letters are worth spending some time with on this point. He was a man of moderate senatorial wealth, not among the richest of his day, but comfortable enough to maintain several properties, to act as a generous patron to many clients, and to live what he clearly considered a good and appropriate life. His agricultural income came primarily from his estates in Tuscany and near Como, in northern Italy. He describes these estates with affection and some frustration, because agricultural income was notoriously variable and dependent on weather, crop conditions, and the management of tenants and slaves. A bad harvest on an important estate could significantly affect the income of even a wealthy senator, and the agricultural basis of Roman noble wealth meant that wealth itself was somewhat volatile. On top of agricultural income, Pliny had income from urban property, most likely insulae in various towns and possibly in Rome itself. Urban rental income from apartment buildings was more stable than agricultural income, though buildings required maintenance and tenants sometimes failed to pay. Pliny was also the recipient of legacies from friends and clients, which was a recognized form of income in the Roman world. The practice of leaving portions of one's estate to friends and patrons was common, and a man of Pliny's position might expect to receive a series of such legacies over the course of a lifetime, each one providing a lump sum that could be reinvested or spent. His expenditures were substantial. He contributed to the education costs of children from his community, which he describes in one letter as building a school at Comum, his hometown, at his own expense, on the condition that the townspeople also contribute something and therefore have a stake in its quality. He contributed to the dowries of daughters of friends and clients who could not manage without assistance. He made substantial gifts to his hometown for various purposes: the building of a library, contributions to public games. He funded the distribution of money to his clients at various points. He maintained multiple households with their associated slave staffs, upkeep costs and supply needs. The figures he gives, when he gives them, are illuminating. A contribution of 300,000 cestus to the school at Comum, 1/4 of the total cost. A bequest to a friend or client of 100,000 cestus mentioned almost in passing. These were significant sums by any ordinary standard, representing decades of wages for a working person, and yet Pliny discusses them without visible strain, suggesting that his overall financial position was comfortable enough to absorb them. The really grand expenditures of Roman noble life were in construction. Building a great house in Rome or a substantial villa in the country cost enormous sums. The raw materials, marble quarried in the mountains and transported by ship and wagon to Rome, timber from the forests, the specialized craftspeople required for mosaic floors and painted walls and carved stonework, all of this was expensive. And beyond construction, furnishing and maintaining the property added ongoing costs. The most spectacular example of Roman noble construction is probably the great villa of Hadrian at Tivoli, though this was of course an imperial property rather than a private one. But several private villas from the Roman period that have been partially excavated show a scale of ambition and investment that is genuinely impressive. The villa of Poppaea at Oplontis, near Pompeii, preserved by the same eruption that buried Pompeii itself, is a complex of extraordinary size and quality, with painted rooms of the highest standard, a large swimming pool, complex garden arrangements, and the evidence of regular renovation and upgrading over the generations. The Villa of the Mysteries, also at Pompeii, is famous for its room painted with a continuous frieze depicting what appears to be a mystery cult initiation, and that frieze represents a painting commission of exceptional ambition and cost. Whoever owned that villa wanted the best painted room in Campania, and they may well have succeeded. Furniture in a Roman noble household represented another area of significant expenditure. Citrus wood, a rare mottled wood from North Africa, was the most prized material for dining tables, and Pliny the Elder describes tables of citrus wood that cost hundreds of thousands of sesterces. This seems impossible until you remember that these were not merely tables. They were investment pieces, status objects, heirlooms, and they were made from material that was genuinely rare and difficult to obtain. Ivory was used for inlays and decorative elements. Tortoiseshell appeared on beds and couches. Bronze fittings were standard in any quality piece of furniture. The textiles that furnished a Roman noble house were also expensive and significant. Curtains of embroidered or dyed fabric, coverings for couches and beds, cushions and hangings all represented real investment. Purple-dyed fabric, the Tyrian purple produced from the murex snail, was extraordinarily expensive, more expensive per pound than gold in some periods. Its use was eventually regulated by sumptuary laws, and then reserved by imperial edict for imperial use. But in the earlier periods of the Republic and Empire, wealthy Romans wore purple-trimmed clothing as a matter of course, and covered their dining couches in purple fabric as a display of their means. The cost of putting on an appropriate dinner party included not just food and wine, but the rental or ownership of silver service, the hiring of entertainers, the provision of appropriate lighting, and in some cases the provision of gifts to guests, which was a recognized practice for the most lavish entertainments. The sparsio, the throwing of gifts or gift tokens to guests or to crowds at public entertainments, was another form of Roman conspicuous generosity. All of this adds up to a picture of a class that spent money as a social performance as much as for any straightforward pleasurable purpose. Roman noble expenditure was public, it was competitive, and it was a primary mechanism by which status was established and maintained. The man who put on better games than his rival, whose dinner parties drew more distinguished guests, whose house on the Palatine was more magnificently decorated, was winning a competition that had real political and social consequences. And yet this very same culture produced Stoic philosophers who argued, sometimes persuasively, for the irrelevance of external goods and the superiority of the simple life. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor of the 2nd century, writing in the Meditations, disciplines himself repeatedly against attachment to wealth and luxury, reminding himself of their transience and their irrelevance to virtue. Seneca, one of the wealthiest men of his age, wrote brilliant essays on the virtues of frugality while living in what his critics pointedly noted was extreme personal luxury. This tension between the rhetoric of Stoic simplicity and the practice of Roman noble opulence is one of the great ironies of the period, and it runs through the literature so persistently that it must have been felt as a genuine personal contradiction by many of the people we are discussing. The Roman noble knew that his culture theoretically valued restraint and practically rewarded display. He was expected to be generous, which required money, and contemptuous of money, which was not quite the same thing as being poor. Let us talk now about travel in the Roman world, because it is easy to forget how much movement was involved in the lives of the nobility, and how different travel was from anything we know. The road system of the Roman Empire was one of the engineering achievements of antiquity. The great roads, the Via Appia, the Via Flaminia, the Via Aurelia, and dozens of others, ran from Rome to every corner of Italy and beyond, through the provinces of the empire, maintained by a system of public obligation and military engineering that kept them in reasonable condition for centuries. Roman roads were built with surveyor's precision, paved with stone, provided with drainage, and spanned by bridges and causeways at river crossings. Travel on these roads was still slow and physically demanding by modern standards. A traveller on foot covered perhaps 20 to 25 miles a day on a good day. On horseback, the pace could be somewhat faster, though the condition of ancient horses and the limitation of stirrups, which the Romans did not use in the form we know, imposed their own limits. In a carriage, the cursus publicus, the state post system that provided fast horses at relay stations for official messengers, could achieve impressive speeds over short distances, but private travel in carriages was more comfortable and slower. A journey from Rome to Pompeii, roughly 150 miles, might take a week of comfortable travel with an appropriate retinue. A journey to northern Italy, to the region near Como where Pliny was born, might take 10 days to 2 weeks. Travel to the provinces, to Spain, to North Africa, to the eastern Mediterranean, was measured in weeks and months and carried real physical risks. Roman nobles travelled with significant entourages. The roads were not safe enough, and the comfort requirements of the class not modest enough, for solo travel in anything approaching simplicity. A senator moving from Rome to his country estate would travel with a retinue of slaves, pack animals carrying luggage and provisions, possibly a litter for riding in, possibly a carriage, certainly a mounted escort of some kind. Inns, the tabernae and capornae, existed along the roads but were considered rough by any senatorial standard. The wealthy preferred to stay with friends or in their own properties, if the route permitted. The letter of introduction, the Epistula Commendatoria, was an essential travel document for anyone moving through the elite world. If Pliny was travelling to a region where he did not himself have property or close friends, a letter from a mutual acquaintance to a local notable would secure him appropriate hospitality. The network of hospitality and obligation that ran through the senatorial class across the empire meant that a Roman senator travelling from Italy to Asia Minor, for example, could string together a series of hosts who would be obligated to receive him appropriately. Provincial life for Roman nobles stationed or living outside Italy was its own particular experience. The great provincial capitals, Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, Carthage in North Africa, Lugdunum in Gaul, Londinium in Britain, had their own versions of Roman noble life, transplanted and adapted to local conditions. A governor's wife in Britain was living in a world that was simultaneously very Roman, with its forum and baths and temples and organized administrative life, and very far from the center of things, colder and wetter and more physically demanding than Italy, with a local culture that was only partially Romanized and whose integration with the imperial system varied enormously. British Britain in particular represents an interesting case because some of the best archaeological evidence for Roman noble life in the provinces comes from Britain. The great villa complexes of the Romano-British period, sites like Fishbourne in Sussex or Chedworth in Gloucestershire, or the Woodchester Villa in Gloucestershire, with its extraordinary mosaic of Orpheus charming the animals, show a style of Roman life maintained at real quality in a quite distant and relatively unglamorous province. The people who owned and built these establishments were real Roman nobles, or at least Romanized British aristocrats, and they were trying to live recognizably Roman lives in a very different landscape. The famous letters from the Roman fort at Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall in Northumberland, written on small wooden tablets that have miraculously survived, include among the military and administrative correspondence a birthday party invitation from one officer's wife to another, asking her friend Lepidina to come to a birthday celebration. The tone is warm, direct, and entirely human, crossing nearly 2,000 years to speak to us in a voice that sounds remarkably contemporary. I invite you, my dearest sister, to come to us on the day before the Ides of September to celebrate my birthday and to make the day more enjoyable for me by your presence, if you come. Sisters, the word used to address a friend across social bonds, the warmth of the invitation, the hope for the friend's presence to make a birthday joyful. This is Rome, not in the marble corridors of power, but in the muddy reaches of a northern frontier fort, in the voice of a woman who is cold and far from home and longing for companionship. This brings us to something we should address directly, which is the question of women's friendship and the social world of the noblewoman beyond her role in relation to her husband and household. Roman noblewomen maintained their own social networks, their own friendships, their own sets of relationships that operated parallel to, and sometimes entangled with, but not simply dependent on those of their husbands. The evidence for this is scattered throughout the literary sources, women mentioned in letters as correspondents, women who appear as patrons to other women, women who attended religious events together, women who advised each other on childbirth and child-rearing and household management. There is a tendency in popular history to imagine the social world of Roman women as primarily domestic and isolated, each woman confined to her own household with limited contact with others. The reality was considerably more sociable. Morning visits between women of similar rank were a regular feature of social life. Women attended the baths together, women participated together in the religious festivals and processions that were part of the civic calendar. Women met at the markets and at the houses of mutual friends and at the public spaces of the city. The patronage system that structured so much of Roman social life applied to women as well as men. Roman noblewomen had their own clients, people who depended on their favor, their recommendations, their intercession with powerful husbands or fathers. Freed women who had been slaves in the household might remain connected to their former mistress as clients, providing labor or services and receiving protection and occasional help in return. Female clients from outside the household might seek the intercession of a powerful matron with her husband, and the Roman sources record a number of instances of women successfully making such intercessions. The friendship between women of similar rank could be genuine and deep. Cicero's letters mention his daughter Tullia's friends with evident knowledge of their characters and situations. Pliny the Younger writes about the women of his social circle with clear knowledge of their individual personalities, their health, their family situations, their intellectual interests. He describes one noblewoman, Fannia, with obvious admiration, noting her courage in accompanying her husband into exile and her commitment to the memory of the Stoic philosophers whose cause the family had supported. This is not merely polite description. It is the description of a real person whose qualities Pliny found genuinely impressive. The reading and writing practices of Roman noblewomen deserve a bit more attention than we have given them, because they open onto a world of intellectual life that is often under-supported in popular discussions. Roman women of the noble class read extensively. The evidence for this comes from multiple sources, references in letters to books being sent and received, discussions in letters of literary topics that assume a correspondent's familiarity with the texts, the occasional direct evidence of women composing their own texts. The love poet Ovid addressed his work explicitly to female readers and assumed their familiarity with the literary tradition. He imagined women at home reading his poetry, recognizing his references, appreciating his wit. This was not wishful thinking on his part. It was based on a real audience. Women wrote. The letters of Cornelia, real or attributed, show a woman comfortable with prose composition. The poetry of Sulpicia shows a poet who had absorbed the elegiac tradition deeply enough to write in it with confidence and originality. Various other women are mentioned in ancient sources as having written in various forms. Most of this writing has not survived, which is not surprising given the general attrition of ancient literature, but the references to it suggest a real tradition of female literary production that the surviving canon, dominated by male authors, does not adequately represent. Roman women also engaged with philosophy. Musanius Rufus, the Stoic philosopher of the 1st century CE, wrote explicitly that women as well as men should be educated in philosophy, arguing that virtue was the same in both and that the same training was therefore appropriate. His argument was not universally accepted, but it was made and taken seriously, and it reflects a debate that was ongoing in the educated circles of the early empire. The Epicurean Garden, the Platonic Academy, the various Stoic schools that had their teachers and their followers in Rome during the late Republic and early Empire. All of these philosophical traditions had women among their interested followers. Philosophy in the Roman sense was not merely academic, it was a guide to how to live, and the questions it addressed, about how to handle grief, about what constitutes a good life, about how to maintain equanimity in the face of illness and death and loss, were deeply relevant to the actual conditions of Roman noble life, which involved real exposure to all of these things. Cicero, devastated by the death of Tullia in 45 BCE, retreated to his country property and threw himself into reading and writing philosophy as a form of grief management. He produced several of his most important philosophical works in this period, works addressed to his educated friends and in some cases to his wife, and the grief that underlies them is entirely palpable. The Consolation that he wrote for himself, which does not survive, drew on the Stoic tradition of philosophical consolation while never quite achieving the equanimity it was supposed to produce. His letters of the period are raw with feeling, describing a loss he could not console himself for. This is the human reality that underlies all the marble and the banqueting. Roman nobles were people who loved their children and lost them, who loved their spouses and lost them, who aged and became ill and faced death with whatever resources, philosophical or religious or simply human, they had available. The mortality that we mentioned earlier in connection with childbirth and infant death applied equally to adults. Pliny the Younger lost several of his close friends to illness during the years covered by his letters, and his grief is evident in the letters he wrote after their deaths. The philosopher and orator Fronto, tutor to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, lost multiple children during his lifetime, and his letters of grief over these deaths are among the most emotionally affecting texts that survive from antiquity. Marcus Aurelius himself writes in the Meditations about the deaths of children and of people one loves, and his Stoic counsel to himself, to accept what cannot be changed, to keep perspective, to remember the transience of all things, reads as the advice of a man who actually needed it. Roman funerary practice was elaborate and significant. The death of a member of the senatorial class triggered a sequence of rituals that involved the entire household and extended outward into the social network. The body was washed and anointed by slaves. It was displayed in the atrium for a period of days, with family and clients coming to pay their respects. The formal funeral procession, the funus, involved paid mourners, musicians, actors wearing the masks of the family's distinguished ancestors, and a procession through the public spaces of the city to the place of burial. This procession was explicitly public, explicitly political. The display of the ancestral imagines, the wax masks of distinguished family members, was a statement about the family's history and its claim on public respect. The lauditio funebris, the funeral speech, was delivered in a public setting, usually the forum, and reviewed the life and achievements of the deceased in terms that were consciously addressed to the audience of citizens as much as to the grieving family. The funeral was the last, and in some ways the most important public performance of a Roman noble's life. Women received public funerals. The laudatio could be delivered by a family member, and there are several surviving texts of funeral speeches delivered for women of the Roman nobility, including the famous Laudatio Turiae, a long inscription that preserves in first person a husband's account of his wife's virtues and their life together. The inscription describes a woman who managed the household during her husband's absence in a civil war, who faced down soldiers who came to the house with remarkable courage, who suggested that her husband divorce her when it became clear she could not have children, and who was persuaded with difficulty to remain married. The emotional register of this text is extraordinary, a genuine love letter carved in stone. Let us think about the cultural and intellectual life of Rome more broadly, because the noblewomen of Rome lived in a city that was one of the great cultural centers of the ancient world, and their access to and participation in that culture was real. The Roman literary culture of the late Republic and early Empire produced texts that are still read, still influential, still genuinely remarkable. Virgil's Aeneid, composed in the late 1st century BCE, was essentially the national epic, the text that established the mythological foundation of Roman identity, and it was read by educated Romans of all classes with an intensity of engagement that we would reserve for the most central texts of our own culture. Horace's poetry, the odes and satires and epistles, offered both lyric beauty and social commentary of enduring quality. Ovid's Metamorphoses, a vast mythological poem of tremendous inventiveness, was a tour de force of narrative and transformation. These texts were performed as well as read. Public readings, the recitations at which Pliny both suffered and occasionally delighted, were a regular feature of urban intellectual life. A poet reading new work in a private salon or a borrowed public space was offering his audience something that combined the pleasures of reading with something closer to performance. The audience responded, applauded, commented, criticized. The relationship between author and audience in Rome was more direct and more reciprocal than in our world of largely private reading. Theatre was also part of Roman cultural life, though its social meaning was complicated by the fact that performers were legally of low status, infamous in Roman law, which created a persistent tension between the popularity of theatrical performance and the theoretical contempt for those who provided it. Roman comedy, tragedy, and pantomime were all performed in public theatres of considerable scale and attended by all classes, with seating arranged hierarchically to reflect social rank. Women attended the theatre, though they were required to sit in the less desirable upper sections, along with the poor and the foreigners. The gladiatorial games and the chariot races in the Circus Maximus were the most popular public entertainments of Rome, drawing audiences measured in tens of thousands. The Circus Maximus at its largest could hold an estimated 250,000 spectators. The Colosseum, completed under the Emperor Titus in 80 CE, held perhaps 50,000. These were not niche entertainments. They were the mass culture of the Roman world, and the noble classes both attended them and were expected to provide them, at least those who held the relevant magistracies that came with the obligation to put on public games. Roman noblewomen attended the games. The seating arrangements in the amphitheatre placed women in the upper sections, just as in the theatre, except for the Vestal virgins who had privileged front-row seating. But the games themselves were attended by everyone, and the excitement and social atmosphere of the arena was genuinely part of life for people of all classes. Seneca famously complained that he came home from the games a worse person than he had left, infected by the bloodlust of the crowd. This is probably more Stoic rhetoric than literal truth, but it captures something about the intensity of the atmosphere. The crowd at Roman gladiatorial games was genuinely passionate, partisan, vocal, and capable of both demanding mercy for a fallen gladiator and demanding his death, depending on how he had performed. The political dimension of the games, in which the emperor or the magistrates who hosted them were expected to respond to crowd preferences, made the arena a space where popular sentiment could be expressed and to some degree heard in a way that was not available in other forms. The arts in Rome were patronized by the nobility in ways that shaped what was produced. Maecenas, the great patron of the Augustan age, was not himself a senator but an intimate advisor to Augustus, and his support for Virgil and Horace and other poets of the period shaped Roman literature in ways that are still felt. Wealthy collectors purchased Greek art at enormous prices, stripped it from the sanctuaries and cities of Greece and Asia Minor, and installed it in Roman houses and gardens. The resulting accumulation of Greek sculpture in Roman noble houses is one of the stranger features of the period, a conquered civilization providing the decorative arts for its conquerors. Roman sculpture itself developed in a direction that combined Greek technical traditions with specifically Roman interests, particularly the interest in realistic portraiture. Roman portrait sculpture of the Republican period especially has a directness and specificity of individual characterization that is quite different from the idealized generality of Greek sculpture. These are faces of real people, captured with their actual warts and wrinkles and asymmetries, and they communicate a personality and a presence that crosses the centuries with startling immediacy. We have busts and portraits of Roman noblewomen from the 1st and 2nd centuries that show us real individuals. The portraits of women from the Flavian period, the 70s through 90s CE, are particularly famous for their elaborate hairstyles, which in the portraits appear as complex architectural arrangements of curls and braids that reflect the actual fashion of the period in extraordinary detail. These are not idealized types, they are women, specific women, who sat for their portraits or whose portraits were made from life masks or death masks, and whose individuality is preserved in the stone. Looking at these portraits, you feel the gap between yourself and them suddenly narrow. She had strong opinions about her hair, whoever she was. She wanted to be remembered in her best style, in the fashion of her moment. She chose this face to show the world, or her sculptor chose it for her, or some negotiation between them produced this specific and preserved rendering of a specific human being who lived nearly 2,000 years ago. This is what makes Roman history genuinely moving when you let it be. Not the dates and the battles and the lists of emperors, but the women in their portraits, the birthday invitation from Vindolanda, the husband's inscription for his wife's virtue, the philosopher-emperor's late-night notes to himself about how to be better, the poet's grief for his daughter, the matron managing her household in the early morning while the city outside was still making its nighttime noise. Let us talk about a few more specific aspects of noble Roman life that we have not yet fully explored, because there are dimensions to this world that deserve their own attention. The Roman garden, for instance. We have mentioned gardens in connection with the layout of the Roman house, but Roman gardens deserve more than a passing reference because they were genuinely important to the nobility's sense of what a good life looked like. The younger Pliny's descriptions of his gardens are among the most detailed we have from antiquity. His Laurentine villa garden, which he describes in a long letter to his friend Gallus, includes box hedges clipped into shapes, plantings of rosemary and ivy, mulberry and fig trees, a kitchen garden producing vegetables and herbs, and views of the sea. His Tuscan villa garden is even more elaborate, with a hippodrome, a long oval garden designed for walking or riding, surrounded by plane trees with ivy trained up their trunks, a covered walkway of vines, a marble triclinium from which water flowed into the dining area for cooling and entertainment, and beds of violets and other flowers arranged to create patterns on the ground. This is gardening as art, as architecture, as an expression of the ordered mind applied to natural materials. The Romans were deeply invested in the idea of bringing nature under human control and shaping it into forms that reflected human intelligence and taste. The clipped topiary, the geometrically arranged beds, the carefully trained vines and climbing plants, all of this expressed a relationship with the natural world that was simultaneously appreciative and dominating. At the same time, Roman gardens contained genuine plants with genuine sensory qualities. The smell of rosemary in the sun, the color of violets and roses, the shade of the plane trees, the sound of water in the fountains, these were not merely conceptual arrangements. They were places where people actually spent time, walking, reading, thinking, having conversations, watching birds, feeling the sun on their skin and the breeze from the sea. Pliny describes reading in his garden as one of the pleasures of country life. He describes it as his decompression from the demands of urban life, his restoration, the capacity to walk in a garden and feel the restoration that physical beauty and the natural world provide. This is not uniquely Roman, it is genuinely human, but the Romans made it a deliberate part of their design of the good life, and the care that went into their gardens reflects how seriously they took that capacity. The Roman relationship with water deserves particular mention. The aqueducts delivered water to the city, but the Romans also used water as an element of design in ways that were technically sophisticated and visually extraordinary. Fountains in public spaces and private gardens, nymphia, elaborate grotto-like water features, small streams directed through garden spaces, pools and fish ponds. The sound of moving water was deliberately incorporated into the experience of Roman spaces, both public and private. Pliny's description of water being directed through channels into the outdoor dining area of his Tuscan villa is charming in its specific pleasurableness. The cool sound and feel of water on a hot Italian afternoon, the visual entertainment of watching it flow. The thermal springs at Baiae in the Bay of Naples were one of the great pleasures of the Roman wealthy class. Baiae was essentially a resort town, the Neapolitan Riviera of the ancient world, and its combination of natural hot springs, beautiful scenery, proximity to the sea, and concentration of extremely wealthy residents made it a place of perpetual social excitement and perpetual moral anxiety. Roman writers are full of warnings about the corrupting pleasures of Baiae, which they describe as a place where the normal rules of social propriety were relaxed to a degree that made it simultaneously appealing and dangerous. The presence of so many wealthy, leisured people in a beautiful setting, with the social inhibitions of the city somewhat loosened by vacation atmosphere, produced the kind of behavior that fed gossip and satire for generations. Cicero had a property at Baiae, so did Julius Caesar, so did Hortensius. The coastline was effectively lined with senatorial villas for miles in both directions. The natural harbours were full of pleasure boats. The hot springs, accessed through underground passages in the volcanic rock, were famous throughout the ancient world. Pliny the Elder, who died when he sailed toward the eruption of Vesuvius out of curiosity and a desire to rescue survivors, was at his villa near Misenum, just north of the Baiae coastline when it happened. And this brings us inevitably to that eruption and to the city of Pompeii, which gives us our most intimate evidence of how Roman people actually lived. Pompeii was not a particularly grand city. It was a prosperous town on the coast of Campania, with a population of perhaps 20,000 at the time of its destruction in 79 CE. It had its own civic life, its own forum, its own amphitheatre, its own public baths, its own temples, its own bakeries and restaurants and shops and brothels and private houses. It was the kind of place that a Roman senator might pass through on the way to Baiae without stopping, or might own a small holiday property in if the prices were right and the location convenient. What the eruption preserved was not the grandest expression of Roman noble life. It preserved the everyday reality of a prosperous town, and that everyday reality is in many ways more illuminating than the grandest examples would be, because it shows us the texture rather than the peaks. The houses of the wealthy in Pompeii, the House of the Faun with its magnificent Alexander mosaic and its enormous atrium that matches or exceeds what you would find in a comparable house in Rome, the Villa of the Mysteries with its extraordinary painted frieze, the House of the Vetii with its detailed garden paintings and its elaborate reception rooms. These were the homes of wealthy Pompeians, not senators but men of the equestrian class and prosperous freedmen and traders who had made serious money. And they lived, the evidence shows, lives that were recognizably Roman in all the essential ways. They had their lararia and made their daily offerings. They had their triclinia and gave their dinner parties. They had their gardens and their fountains. They had their beautiful painted walls. They had their household slaves and their freed clients and their business associates. They had their afternoon visits to the baths and their morning trips to the forum. They had their graffiti-covered walls, because Pompeii's walls are covered with graffiti, election endorsements and gladiator ratings and declarations of love and rude jokes, which tell you more about the actual mental life of the Roman street than any formal literary text. On the day of the eruption, they had no warning. The volcano had been showing signs of activity for years, small earthquakes, disturbances in the water supply, but the Romans of the area did not know what a volcanic eruption looked like, because Vesuvius had not erupted in historical memory. Pliny the Elder, sailing toward it, apparently thought it was a large fire. The catastrophe was literally unprecedented in the local experience. The bodies preserved by the volcanic material, The famous plaster casts made by 19th century archaeologists who poured plaster into the voids left by decomposed bodies in the hardened volcanic material show us real people in their real positions at the moment of death. A woman with a ring still on her finger, clutching coins she had grabbed as she tried to flee. A child curled in a posture that might have been sleep if it were not for the context. A gladiator in the barracks, still chained to the wall. A man covering his face with his tunic against the ash. These are the dead of Pompeii, and they are in some sense the most direct evidence we have of Roman human life, because they are no longer evidence at all. They are people. We should spend a moment on the last few hours of Roman noble life before we begin drawing toward our conclusion, because we have traced the day from morning to evening, and now we approach the night once more, the night that every life ends in, eventually. The Roman attitude toward death, as we have touched on, was shaped by multiple traditions. The Stoic tradition of prepared acceptance, the Epicurean argument that death was nothing to fear since death was simply the absence of consciousness, the more popular religious traditions that imagined an underworld of shades, and the continued existence of the demons. None of these provided comfort in exactly the way that modern religious traditions often do, and the evidence of Roman mourning behavior suggests that the philosophical acceptance was often the ideal rather than the reality. Roman tombs, which had to be placed outside the city walls by law, lined the roads leading out of Rome and every Roman city, visible to every traveller arriving or departing. They ranged from simple stone markers to elaborate architectural monuments, and for the nobility they could be genuinely impressive structures. The tomb of Caecilia Metella on the Via Appia, a massive cylindrical drum of stone that still stands outside Rome, was built in the 1st century BCE for a woman whose family wanted her remembered on the most travelled road in the world. The inscription tells us only that she was the daughter of Quintus Caecilius Metellus Criticus and the wife of Crassus, but the scale of the tomb tells us that the family's wealth and ambition were enormous. Roman epitaphs are one of the richest sources we have for ordinary and extraordinary Roman life. They were set up by the bereaved, and they reflect both conventional formulas and genuine personal expression. Dis manibus, to the divine spirits of the ancestors, is the standard opening. Then the name, sometimes the age at death, sometimes the number of years, months and days of a marriage, which suggests a precise record-keeping of the duration of happiness. Sometimes a brief description of the qualities of the deceased: bona, good; pia, dutiful; modesta, modest; fidelis, faithful. Occasionally something more expansive, a few lines of verse, a description of an accomplishment, an expression of grief. The epitaphs of Roman noblewomen often cluster around a set of virtues that are recognizably the virtues the culture valued and expected: domestic competence, fidelity to husband, care for children, modesty of deportment, correct religious observance. These are real virtues, not merely patriarchal impositions, though the relative narrowness of the approved female virtue set compared to the approved male virtue set reflects genuine inequality. But within those virtues, the individual women are visible. The specific woman who was especially gentle with her slaves, the one who was known for her generosity, the one whose conversation was particularly valued by her friends. And sometimes the grief is so raw that even 2,000 years of distance cannot entirely muffle it. The man who writes on his wife's stone that he lived with her for 38 years without a quarrel, and that the most painful part of her death is that she died first. The mother who records the age of her child in years and months and days with a precision that speaks of the counting of days as a way of holding on. The husband who calls his wife the companion of all my plans, the sharer of all my joys and griefs. These people were real. These losses were real. The beautiful houses and the extraordinary silver and the peacock at the dinner table do not change that. They were people who loved and lost and mourned and tried to find words for grief, and in some cases found very good ones. Let us think, before we close, about what the Roman noblewoman's life actually added up to, what the shape of it was, from its beginning to its end. She was born into a family whose status determined the outline of her existence before she drew her first breath. If the family kept her, if she was not exposed as an infant for reasons of gender or deformity or poverty, which was considerably more common among the poorer classes but happened in noble families too under specific circumstances. She was likely welcomed and named on her dies lustricus, the day of purification, the 8th or 9th day of life depending on gender. She grew up in the household under the care of a nurse, a nutrix, whose role was deeply important in Roman family life. The relationship between Roman children and their nurses was typically close, and Roman writers often mention their nurses with genuine warmth. The nurse taught the child its first words, its first songs, its first understanding of the world. She was often a slave, but the emotional bond she formed with the children in her care could be real and lasting. The girl was educated. She learnt to read, to write, to do arithmetic, to read Greek, to play the lyre, to understand the literature of her culture. She learnt the management of household affairs by watching her mother and being gradually given responsibilities of her own. She learnt the religious practices of the household. She learnt through observation and explicit instruction how to be a Roman matron. She was married, likely in her mid-teens, to a man chosen by her father in negotiation with the man's family. The age of marriage for Roman noble women has been debated, but the evidence suggests that betrothals might happen in childhood, while marriages often took place around the age of 12 to 14, at or shortly after puberty. Roman law set 12 as the minimum age for a girl to marry, and the early marriage of girls from elite families served the political purposes of alliance building between families that were its primary motivation. She went to her husband's house. She might be formally under the legal authority of her husband in manus marriage, a relatively ancient form by the imperial period, or she might remain legally under her father's authority in the more common sine manu form, which preserved more of her legal independence and connection to her natal family. The practical implications of these different forms are complex, but in practice the matron in her husband's house ran the household and managed the children regardless of the precise legal form of her marriage. She probably bore multiple children. The infant mortality rate meant that bearing children and losing them was not an exceptional experience but a normal part of reproductive life. The grief of losing a child was not something you could avoid by social position or wealth or the most devoted nursing. The rich lost children just as the poor did, though perhaps at slightly lower rates thanks to better nutrition and better access to medical care. She managed her household through the years of her husband's career, supporting his political advancement with her own social networks, overseeing the domestic operation that his career required, managing the properties when he was absent, raising children who would carry the family's name and tradition into the next generation. She participated in the religious and cultural life of her city. She read, corresponded, attended readings and performances, maintained friendships that were intellectually and emotionally sustaining. She may have had a genuine aesthetic life, surrounding herself with beautiful objects and spaces and taking pleasure in them. She probably had strong opinions about most things and expressed them at least in private. She aged. Roman beauty culture, which valued youth and pale skin and the unmarked face of the young, was not kind to aging. Roman satirists, who are never at their most admirable when writing about women, were particularly vicious about older women who tried to maintain youthful appearances or who continued to be interested in love and pleasure after the culturally approved age for such things had passed. This is a misogyny that has depressingly consistent parallels across many cultures and many eras. But the actual texture of aging for a Roman noblewoman was more nuanced than the satirists suggest. The matron in middle and old age occupied a position of genuine authority in the family and in the social circle. The grandmother who had overseen the raising of her children was now overseeing the formation of her grandchildren. The woman who had managed a complex household for decades was the most experienced person in many of the rooms she entered. The weight of her years was not merely social burden, it was also real authority accumulated through real experience. She died. She was mourned. If her family had the means and the inclination, she was buried with ceremony, the professional mourners hired to weep appropriately, the procession through the streets, the laudatio delivered in public by a family member who praised her virtues in the hearing of the city. Her tomb was placed outside the walls to be seen by everyone who passed for as long as the stone endured, and sometimes the stone endured for 2,000 years, and someone reads her name inscribed on it and feels, across the gulf of time, the specific gravity of a specific life. This is why we study the Romans, not because they were perfect or because their world was better than ours, because in many ways it was not. The slavery on which everything rested was a moral catastrophe by any standard of human dignity. The inequality between classes was extreme and largely naturalized. The violence of the gladiatorial games and the casual cruelty of the legal system toward those without status represent aspects of Roman civilization that we should not romanticize. But because they were fully human and their humanity pressed into the marble of their houses and the stone of their tombs and the papyrus of their letters and the bronze of their coins and the mosaic of their floors, speaks across the centuries in a voice that is recognizably our own. The Roman noblewoman who rose before dawn to supervise the morning preparations, who received her friends with genuine pleasure, who managed a household of 50 with the skill of a general managing an army, who read her Greek in the afternoon and argued with her husband about literature at dinner, who prayed at the lararium for the health of her children, who wept for those she lost and carried on for those who remained. She is not so remote from us as the distance of years might suggest. She worried about money in the specific way that people worry about money when they have a lot of it and need to maintain the level it implies. She worried about her health and the health of the people she loved. She negotiated the expectations that her society had for her against her own sense of what she was capable of and what she wanted. She found beauty and pleasure in the world around her and made space for them in her days. She faced loss with whatever resources she had and found them sometimes adequate and sometimes not. She was a person, that is what we can say with certainty. She was a person, and her world, which seems so distant and so different, was also in the deepest human ways entirely familiar. As the lamps burn low in the Roman house tonight, as the household slaves bank the coals and close the shutters and take up their night posts, as the dinner guests have departed into the dark streets and the silver is being cleaned and put away, as the mistress of the house moves through the atrium with its pool of sky above and its reflected stars below, moving toward her cubiculum and the rest that the day has earned, we leave her there. Not as a type, not as an emblem of Roman virtue or Roman womanhood or any category we might want to put her in, just as a person at the end of a specific day in a specific house in a city that will outlast her by centuries and by whose dust we are still fascinated. The night is settling around both of you now. Around her in Rome 2,000 years ago, the carts beginning to rumble in the streets and the stars turning slowly overhead. Around you, wherever you are, in whatever quiet room you have found for this hour, with whatever warmth is close to you, some things have changed entirely between her world and yours. Some things have changed very little at all. She was here, she mattered, her days were as real as yours, and now let the night do its work. Rest.